He was just a struggling single dad singing softly to his daughter on a park bench until a stranger nearby stopped walking and quietly began to cry. What connected them was invisible. What followed changed everything. Before we begin, if stories about hope, love, and second chances speak to your heart, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next story that might just stay with you forever. Now, let's begin. A struggling single dad sang to his daughter at the park. Unaware, a woman nearby started crying. The wind was sharp that afternoon, carrying the first hints of fall, the kind of wind that rustled the dry leaves, lifting them just enough to make children chase them and adults button their coats. But Cal had no coat to button. Just a threadbare hoodie and a daughter who hadn't eaten anything but a granola bar since morning. Lila clutched his hand tightly as they crossed the cracked sidewalk into Harrison Park. She was 6, with big, curious eyes and a pink plastic clip in her hair that was starting to lose its spring. Her sneakers were slightly too small. Cal had noticed the way her toes curled, but she hadn't complained once. She rarely did. He scanned the playground. It was modest. 2 rusty swings, a tilted slide, and a sandbox that hadn't seen fresh sand in years. Still, it was a safe space for an hour or two while he figured out what to do next. Cal led her to a bench in the quieter part of the park, shaded by a towering maple tree that seemed too grand for its surroundings. He lifted her onto the bench beside him, gave her a lopsided smile, and pulled his guitar case from beneath the bench. It was old duct-taped on one side, but it was all he had left of the life he'd imagined before jobs disappeared, before his ex left, before parenthood became a solitary act of survival. He opened the case and pulled out the guitar, fingers trembling not from nerves but from hunger and too many nights sleeping in the van. Leela looked up, brightening. "Are you going to play the sleepy song, Daddy?" He nodded. "Only if you promise not to fall asleep on the bench again." She giggled, that light bubbling sound that somehow kept him going. He strummed the first chord, rough, slightly out of tune. But the song wasn't about perfection. It was about memory. Cal began to sing. "Stars don't sleep, they just shine quieter at night. Close your eyes, love, I'll guard you till morning light." It was an old lullaby, not one from any record or radio. One he had heard long ago, back when he was just a boy in a group home somewhere in Ohio. He didn't remember who taught it to him, only that it soothed the sobs of a girl in the bunk next to his when the power went out and the world outside screamed with sirens. He used to hum it for her. Now he sang it for his daughter. Across the park, a woman paused mid-step. Mira Langston was not someone who paused often. CEO of a wellness startup now valued at 8 figures, she had conference calls, time blocks, and meditation alarms stacked with robotic precision. She'd stopped at the park for a walk between meetings, headphones in hand, eyes scanning emails, but something that froze her. That voice, that song. It hit her in the chest like a car backing into her ribs. She stumbled to a nearby bench without realizing her knees suddenly weak. The chords were simple, raw, but the melody carried a gravity that felt personal. Too personal. She blinked, focusing on the man playing. He looked like every struggling father she'd seen in the city, worn clothes, tired eyes, trying to hold the world together for someone small. The little girl was resting her head on his arm, content, safe. But the song. The stars don't sleep. They only shine quieter at night. Her lips parted. That line. That exact line. It wasn't in any published lullaby. It wasn't something you'd hear on TV. It was hers. She had been 8, scared, abandoned. The group home in the suburbs had been cold and loud, and she cried every night for the first 2 months, except the nights when he sang. She never saw his face clearly. Boys and girls were kept in different dorms, but one of them used to hum through the vents. Then, one night, there were words. He had made them up for her. Or maybe for himself. She never knew. Until now. Mira pressed a hand to her lips, fighting an unfamiliar tremble in her throat. Her heart pounded so hard it made her nauseous. 27 years had passed since that group home. She'd been adopted by family in Massachusetts, changed her last name, built a whole new life from dust. But something from that forgotten world was sitting 20 feet away, alive, singing real. She wanted to get up, to speak, to walk over and ask, "Where did you learn that song?" But something in his posture, stooped, guarded, warned her not to interrupt. So she watched, and listened, and cried silently behind her designer sunglasses, feeling more exposed than she had in decades. When the song ended, the little girl clapped and the man chuckled softly. Mira stood hesitated and turned away. She didn't want to scare him. Not yet. Not before she was sure. But she knew. She knew. The man singing to his daughter in the park had once sung to her through vents in a broken building. He had stitched words into darkness and gave her the first real comfort she ever felt as a child. And now he had no idea she was here, watching, remembering, and starting, maybe for the first time in a long while, to feel something she thought was long gone. Hope. The elevator glided silently to the top floor of the Langston Tower, a sleek steel and glass headquarters that gleamed like ambition against the Boston skyline. Mira stood at the back of the elevator car, unmoving, arms crossed tightly as if holding herself together. The doors opened with a soft chime, but she didn't step out. She stared at her reflection in the brushed metal wall. The woman looking back at her was composed, sharp navy blazer heels that clicked with precision, and a face sculpted for press releases. But inside, beneath that polished armor, something had shifted. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. The melody still lingered in her ears like an echo from a dream. Stars don't sleep, they just shine quieter at night. Mira hadn't thought about that song in decades. She hadn't wanted to. The group home was a place she'd buried in the deeper parts of her memory, a faded scar beneath the surface of a perfectly curated life. She'd always told herself she was lucky to get out, that love, stability, and safety were earned, not owed. And yet, that song hadn't come from nowhere. It wasn't part of a soundtrack. It was theirs, hers, and the boy she never really saw but always remembered. His voice had been the only warmth in a world of metal bed frames and institutional beige. They weren't supposed to talk through the vents between dorms, but someone had. Night after night. At first, just humming, then a name. "Hey, you still crying?" And then one night that voice had offered her a lullaby. No adult ever noticed. No staff ever asked. The boy was just a whisper in the dark who sang until she stopped shaking. And when he stopped, when he vanished from the other side of the wall, she'd cried herself to sleep every night for weeks. Then she hardened, promised herself never to rely on anyone again. But that promise was unraveling. Mira stepped off the elevator and into her office, ignoring the receptionist who called out a greeting. She closed the door quietly behind her. Inside, the space was sleek, warm-toned, filled with curated touches of nature plants, abstract paintings, a soft couch. It was designed to feel calm, safe, controlled. She dropped her bag on the desk and sat. Not on the leather chair behind the desk, but on the couch, the place she reserved for the vulnerable moments of other people. Now she was the one unraveling. She pulled out her phone and searched Harrison Park Musician's guitar, single dad, Boston area. Nothing helpful. She searched again local parks, community music events, afternoon performers. Still nothing. Her fingers hovered. What was she even trying to do? He didn't recognize her. He probably wouldn't. She barely remembered his face. Just the song. Just the feeling of someone out there caring enough to hum through walls. But there was something else bothering her. Something more pressing than nostalgia. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that a night's sleep could fix. It was in his shoulders, in the way he kept his body angled toward the little girl like he was expecting the world to come for her. He had the reflexes of someone who'd fought too long with nothing left to give. And the girl, Lila he'd called her, was small, sweet, and heartbreakingly content with a song and a smile. Mira tapped her phone again. This time she searched city records, community support groups, child care aid programs, music therapy centers, anything that might give her a clue. Then paused. "What am I doing?" she asked herself. She, Mira Langston, CEO, keynote speaker, former foster kid, turned Forbes featured entrepreneur, was obsessively hunting a man she hadn't seen since childhood. Not because she needed closure, but because she owed him something. No, not owed. She remembered. There had been one night, cold raining, when the thunder was so loud she'd curled under the blanket sobbing, muffling her cries into her pillow. That night the voice hadn't sung. He'd just said, "Don't worry, I'm scared too. But we'll both make it out. You'll see." And she had. She'd made it out. Maybe it was time to make sure he did too. Mira rose from the couch slowly. She walked to a locked cabinet and pulled out a file, a project she'd shelved long ago. Community Roots Initiative. It had been a dream back when her startup was still scrappy and idealistic, offered job training and childcare for struggling single parents in partnership with arts programs. But it had never launched. Investors thought it was too soft, too unscalable. She flipped through the pages. The outline was still there. So was the funding quietly tucked in her discretionary philanthropy budget. She stared at the mission statement. Help people reclaim the pieces of themselves they were told didn't matter. Her phone buzzed. A reminder, 2 p.m. wellness briefing. She dismissed it. Instead, she opened a new tab and typed "Set up meeting with director of local group homes." Her old one was still running now, under a new name. She hadn't set foot near it in 20 years. Maybe it was time. That night, Mira couldn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of her penthouse condo. The windows overlooked the harbor, all lights and glass and everything she'd once dreamed of. But it felt cold. She pulled her blanket tighter, closed her eyes. And without meaning to, she whispered the first line of that lullaby. "Stars don't sleep." Her voice cracked. Somewhere out there, the boy who once calmed her storms was still singing, only now to a little girl who looked at him like he held the whole sky. And maybe, just maybe, it was her turn to give a little of that sky back. The next day was colder. The kind of cold that seeped through clothes and settled into bones, the kind that made people walk faster, heads down, gloves tight. But Cal moved slower. He stood on the sidewalk outside the small shipping warehouse, shoulders hunched against the wind, one hand resting on the worn guitar case at his side. Inside the building, a manager was explaining apologetically but firmly that the temp job he'd been promised had already been filled. Budget cuts. Nothing personal. Cal didn't argue. He just nodded, thanked the man quietly, and stepped back into the cold. Lila was at the community center daycare for a few hours thanks to a kind woman at the local church who had pulled strings. Cal had spent the last 3 hours walking first to the warehouse, then to the local diner, asking about dishwashing shifts, then to the music store on Main Street, where he'd offered to tune instruments for free if it might turn into something regular. Nothing. Everyone was polite, but no one said yes. Now he stood near the corner of Harrison and 6th, the guitar case heavier in his hand than ever before. Not physically, emotionally. It used to feel like hope. Now it felt like history, his, not anyone else's. He walked back toward the park. He didn't know why. Maybe it was routine. Maybe it was because that was where Lila had smiled yesterday for the first time in days. Or maybe, though he wouldn't admit it, it was because of the woman in the tan coat with the unreadable eyes. She had watched him with a look he couldn't place. Not pity, not fear. Something else. He reached the bench under the maple tree, now losing more of its red-gold leaves. He sat, rubbing his hands together to warm them. Then he took out the guitar, tuned it slowly, and began to play, not for an audience, not even for Lila this time, just to feel something move through his fingers that didn't feel like survival. Across the park, Mira stood at the edge of the walking path, hidden partly behind a lamppost, holding a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She watched him. He didn't see her. He was too focused, too inside the music. Mira had spent the entire night trying to convince herself that this was absurd, that she should just move on, let the past stay where it was. But she couldn't. She had even checked her schedule this morning, told her assistant to block out the afternoon with a vague personal development label. And now, here she was, standing like a ghost on the edge of someone else's life. But she'd come for a reason. When Cal finished his song, she finally stepped forward. Her heels clicked gently on the pavement, and Cal looked up startled. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Mira offered a careful smile. "I heard you yesterday," she said. Her voice was calm even. "Your song, it stayed with me." Cal squinted slightly, studying her. She looked polished, confident. Way out of his world, but there was something kind in her eyes. "Thanks," he said quietly. "My daughter likes that one. She's not here today, daycare, just for the morning." A friend pulled some strings. He hesitated, then added, "Helps me look for work." Mira nodded. "You're a musician." He laughed softly without joy. "Not anymore. Just a dad with a guitar and not enough time to tune it, right?" She smiled again, this time with a flicker of something deeper. "I used to hear that song, a long time ago, in a place I try not to think about." Cal froze. Mira watched his eyes shift just barely, but it was enough. There was something there. Recognition memory. Or maybe just the instinctive tightening of someone who's been hurt too many times. "I'm Mira," she said, offering her hand. He looked at it, then shook gently. "Cal." She sat beside him on the bench, leaving a respectful space. "I don't want to intrude. I just wondered if you wrote that song." Cal looked at the guitar, then at her. "I don't remember," he admitted. "Parts of it, maybe. I think I heard it once. A long time ago. Some words came later. It's been with me ever since." Silence settled between them. Not awkward, just full of things neither of them knew how to say yet. Then Mira asked quietly, "Were you ever in the foster system?" Cal's shoulders twitched. He looked away. "Yeah, years ago. Couple homes. One of them was in Ohio." Mira felt her pulse jump. "Me too." Cal looked back at her slowly. There it was, just a flicker, but real. The same flicker he'd seen in mirrors when he hummed the song alone, the same ghost she had chased all night. "I remember," she whispered. "I was the girl who cried at night. Someone sang that song through the vents. Every night. Until one day it stopped." Cal's mouth parted slightly. He blinked as though trying to process something too old, too fragile. "I didn't know," he said, voice hoarse. "They moved me without warning. I thought you'd stop needing it." Mira looked down at her hands. "I never stopped needing it. I just learned how to be quiet." They sat in silence again this time, both aware it was no longer coincidence. It was recognition. It was two children who had once shared the same pain, now sitting on the same bench, grown weary but still carrying the same thread of music between them. After a moment, Cal asked, "Why now?" Mira looked at him. "Because I think maybe you helped me survive something I didn't know how to survive, and I'm not sure you ever got that in return." He didn't answer. Not yet. But his eyes softened. His grip on the guitar loosened. And for the first time in a long time, the space between them didn't feel so heavy. It felt like the beginning of something that had been waiting years to be found. The faded brick building on the edge of Westvale Avenue hadn't changed much. The name had, from St. Augustine Children's Home to the more hopeful Haven Bridge Community Center, but the bones were the same. The archway still creaked in the wind. The chain-link fence still leaned inward like it was trying to protect what stood behind it. And the old sycamore tree out front, scarred by decades of initials and storm damage, still stood vigil like a weary sentinel. Mira parked across the street and sat in her car, staring at the front steps. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, unmoving. For someone who had negotiated 7-figure deals and stood on TED stages without blinking, it was absurd how this small, quiet building made her pulse race. But this place had held her screams, her silence, her smallest self. She hadn't been back since the day she was adopted at age 8, when the Langstons had driven her away in a beige Volvo and promised her a fresh start. That start had been real in many ways. It had given her education structure, even affection, but it also came with an unspoken rule: never look back. Today, she was breaking that rule. She stepped out of the car, heels clicking lightly on the pavement, and walked through the front gate. A child's laughter echoed from the back lot, a different child in a different time. She paused, took a breath, and walked inside. The lobby smelled of lemon cleaner and something nostalgic, paper maybe, or sunlight filtered through old curtains. A woman with warm eyes and a sunflower pin on her sweater looked up from the front desk. "Hi there," she said with a smile. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," Mira replied, her voice calm but threaded with nerves. "I used to live here. A long time ago. Back when it was still St. Augustine." The woman's eyes widened slightly with recognition. "Oh, wow. That was before my time, but we still have some of the old records. I'm Karen, the director here." Mira extended her hand. "Mira Langston." Karen blinked. "Wait, the Mira Langston." Mira offered a modest smile. "Yes, but today I'm just someone looking for a piece of the past." Karen softened. "Of course, come with me." She led Mira down a narrow hallway that smelled of chalk and old stories. They entered a small records room with metal shelves and folders marked by year. Mira scanned the rows of manila files with a strange ache in her chest. "I'm looking for records around 1996, specifically children in the girls' wing who were later adopted out." Karen pulled a step stool and reached for a top shelf. "It's all been digitized, but I like to keep the physical stuff. It reminds us these were real lives, not just entries in a system." She handed Mira a faded binder labeled Girls 1996-1998. Mira sat at a desk and began turning pages slowly. There she was, entry Najir 412, Amira Daniels, age 6, taken into care after abandonment. Adopted by the Langston family 2 years later. Attached to her file was a scanned drawing, a stick figure girl with long black hair standing next to a giant sun. Her breath caught. On the back of the page, scribbled in messy, childish handwriting, "I like songs. The boy sings to me. Don't tell." Mira's throat tightened. She hadn't remembered writing that. But it was hers. Karen stepped out to give her space. Mira flipped through to the boys' section. She didn't know what she was looking for, just something that would make it real. She had no last name, no face to match to Cal. Just the music. Then she found it. Caleb Jennings, age 7. Transferred mid-year to another facility. Not adopted. There was no photo. Just a note in the margin. Shows musical aptitude. Comforts other children. Emotionally withdrawn after March transition. March. That was when the songs stopped. Mira closed the binder, her heart pounding. It was him. She felt an ache of guilt, of gratitude, of something nameless that had waited decades to surface. Back at the front desk, Karen was chatting softly with a social worker. Mira waited until they finished, then asked, "Would you happen to have any archives of creative activities from that time? Drawings, letters, maybe music?" Karen smiled. "We have boxes. Kids used to write their own little lullabies or poems. Some of it's heartbreaking. Some, oddly, beautiful." She brought out a shoebox-sized container labeled Creative Writing, 1990s, and placed it on the table. Mira opened it slowly. Inside were construction paper collages, crayon scribbles, torn notebook pages. She flipped carefully through them until she saw it. A page folded 3 times, slightly faded. In pencil. "Stars don't sleep. They only shine quieter at night. Close your eyes, little bird. I'll be here." Out of sight. Her hand trembled. At the bottom, signed in shaky handwriting, CJ. She pressed the paper to her chest. For a long moment she sat in silence as the air seemed to shift around her, like the building was whispering back. When she finally stood to leave, she turned to Karen. You run this place with a lot of heart, Mira said. We try, Karen replied gently. It's hard, but every now and then we hear that something we did, or didn't even know we did, mattered. Mira nodded slowly. Someone here once sang to me through a vent. I think it changed the trajectory of my whole life. I just didn't know it until yesterday. That night, Mira sat in her penthouse, the poem laid out before her on the dining table. She stared at it like it might disappear. Cal had no idea he had given her this, that he had been her lifeline. But now she had something to give back. She picked up her phone and opened the draft for the Community Roots Initiative proposal she'd shelved years ago. Then, without hesitation, she typed a new title across the top, The CJ Project Giving Hope a Voice. This time, it wasn't a corporate pitch. It was a promise. The light in the kitchen flickered for the third time that morning, a stuttering blink that Cal could almost time with the beat of his pulse. He sighed and jiggled the overhead switch like it might magically fix everything wrong in their rented apartment. It didn't. He glanced over his shoulder. Lila sat at the tiny kitchen table, crayons scattered in front of her tongue sticking out in concentration as she drew a picture of what looked like a large, smiling dinosaur and a man with a guitar. "That me?" he asked, pouring the last of the cereal into her bowl. "No milk today." She nodded without looking up. "You and me at the park. You're singing. The dinosaur's just visiting." Cal chuckled softly and ruffled her hair. She didn't know how thin the walls were getting, how much rent was overdue, how few groceries were left. He'd sold a few tools and his amp online the night before just to cover daycare for the week. But Lila was still drawing dinosaurs. That counted for something. As he rinsed out the cereal box and dropped it into the recycling, a knock came at the door. Not the kind that startled a polite, almost hesitant rhythm. Cal wiped his hands and opened it. Mira Langston stood there. Today she wore jeans and a forest green jacket instead of her usual business armor. Her hair was tied back, a single notebook in hand. Still, she looked like someone who knew how to command a room, or a boardroom, or a nation. "Hey," she said simply. Cal blinked, caught somewhere between surprise and confusion. Hi. I hope this isn't a bad time," she added quickly. "I wasn't sure how else to reach you." He stepped aside and let her in, still unsure what this visit was. Mira scanned the small apartment quickly but not judgmentally. She noted the neatly folded laundry on the couch, the stack of library books by the TV, and the absence of clutter. Cal's pride lived in every corner of this space. "I brought something," she said, holding up the notebook. Lila peeked over the top of her dinosaur. "Is that the lady from the park?" Mira smiled and crouched to her level. "It is, and you must be the dinosaur artist. I'm Lila. Hi, Lila. I'm Mira. I liked your dad singing very much." Lila beamed and went back to her drawing. Cal crossed his arms, still cautious. "So, what brings you here, really?" Mira straightened. "I've been thinking about your situation, about how we crossed paths again. And I realized something. You helped me once when we were both just kids and didn't know what helping even meant." "You don't owe me anything," Cal said quickly. "I'm not offering charity," she replied just as fast. "I'm offering an opportunity. For both of us." She opened the notebook and laid it on the table between them. Inside were sketches of a program, a community arts initiative, job placement support for single parents, after-school care for their kids. There were bullet points, ideas, grant partners, potential venue spaces. "The CJ Project," Cal read aloud. His voice hesitated over the initials. "You inspired the name," she said softly. He looked up at her, guarded. "Why me? Because I know what it's like to grow up invisible. I know what it's like to think the world's done with you before you've even started. And I also know that one voice, one kind word, one song can be enough to shift something inside someone forever." Cal exhaled slowly and leaned back in the chair. "I'm starting this project whether you say yes or not. But I want you to be part of it. You could help design the music side, teach, perform, help kids who feel like they've been thrown away remember that they're not. He was quiet. Mira continued gentler now. You wouldn't just be staff. You'd help lead, shape the whole thing. Cal glanced at Lila, then back at Mira. You have no idea what it's like to need help and be too proud to ask, he muttered. I do, she said simply. That's exactly why I'm here. He shook his head, the walls coming up fast. You're rich. You have power. You show up in a nice coat and hand me a plan like it's going to fix everything. It won't fix everything, she agreed. But it might fix something. It might give you some ground to stand on. Silence stretched between them. Then Cal stood. I've had a lot of people say they wanted to help, he said. Most of them disappeared before the sentence ended. Mira looked at him, not flinching, not pushing. I'm still here. He studied her for a moment longer, and in that moment something shifted. Not enough to trust, but enough to listen. You'd need a space, he said, finally. In a neighborhood that people actually live in, not some glass-walled loft next to a Whole Foods. Mira smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Later that evening, after Mira left, Cal sat at the same table staring at the notebook she'd let him keep. Lila crawled into his lap and looked at the page again. Are you going to sing to other kids too? She asked. I don't know yet, he answered honestly. Maybe they're scared of thunderstorms like me. He kissed the top of her head. Yeah, maybe. He didn't know if it would work, if it was real, if he had the right to believe in something this big again. But the wall inside him, the one built from years of being let down, had a crack in it now. And through it, just faintly light was beginning to come through. The rain came that night, not the kind that howled or slammed against windows, but the steady, whispering kind that dripped from rooftops and ran in quiet rivulets along sidewalks. Cal liked this kind of rain. It reminded him of things he couldn't name, things long buried under the grind of survival. Lila was asleep early, curled into her blanket like a kitten clutching her well-loved stuffed raccoon. Cal had turned off the lights, leaving only the soft yellow glow from the kitchen to spill across the small living room. On the table, Mira's notebook lay open again, pages filled with possibility. Real possibility. It terrified him. He sat on the edge of the couch guitar, resting across his knees. He hadn't played since Mira's visit. Something about it felt different now, like the music wasn't just his anymore. Instinctively, he reached down and ran his fingers along the inside of the guitar case. A loose piece of lining had always bugged him, and he'd meant to glue it down for months. Tonight, his nail caught on the edge of it again, but this time it peeled back slightly more than before. Curious, he pulled gently. Beneath the lining, tucked deep into the corner seam, was a folded piece of notebook paper. Yellowed. Fragile. He frowned. Carefully, he opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably a child's. Letters, uneven, some backward, written in thick pencil strokes. Stars don't sleep. They only shine quieter at night. Close your eyes, little bird. I'll be here, out of sight. Cal's breath caught in his chest. He remembered that paper. Not where he found it, not how it had ended up in his guitar case, but the words, those were his, or at least they had been once. He read it again, and again. At the bottom was something he didn't remember writing. A small drawing of a bird in a nest, and next to it 2 stick figures. One with a long braid. One holding what looked like a guitar. Then he saw the initials A.D. Amira Daniels. His hands shook. The name came back to him in pieces. Amira, the girl in the bunk 2 doors down, the one who never talked to anyone who cried at night when she thought no one could hear. He'd hummed through the vent once just to drown her out. Then again, the next night, because something in him hated the sound of her crying. And eventually, she'd hummed back. They had never spoken face to face, but for weeks, maybe months, they had been something like friends, or at least survivors of the same system. He pressed the paper flat on the table, heart pounding. A.D. Amira Daniels, Mira Langston. It couldn't be, except It made perfect sense. The careful way she'd asked questions, the song, her presence at the park, the way she said, "I think maybe you helped me survive something I didn't know how to survive." He sat back slowly, staring at the note. His throat felt tight. It wasn't just that they'd met again. It was that she had remembered. And he hadn't. Not until now. The guilt hit him fast, hot and sharp. How could he forget her? Forget what they'd shared? And why had she remembered Carrie had come back? Cal wasn't good with being seen. Years of practice had taught him to live in the margins, to take up as little space as possible. But Mira had looked straight through his defenses, not with pity, but with history. And now he knew why. The next morning, the sun came up behind a veil of mist. Lila tugged at his hoodie as they walked the 2 blocks to daycare. "Daddy, what's wrong? You didn't sing this morning." "Sorry, Bug," he said, gently brushing her cheek. "Just thinking." "Is it the rain?" she asked, scanning the sky like it had betrayed her. "No," he said, and kissed her forehead. "It's a good kind of thinking." She nodded, satisfied, and skipped ahead toward the gate. Cal turned, heading toward the cafe Mira had suggested for their next meeting. She was waiting outside when he arrived, coffee in hand, wrapped in a soft gray scarf. She looked warmer than she had that first day in the park, less guarded. But when she saw him, something in her posture straightened, like she was bracing for something she couldn't quite name. "You found it, didn't you?" she asked before he could speak. He blinked. "The note." Mira's eyes softened. "I was hoping you would. I couldn't be sure. I didn't remember," not fully, Cal admitted. "But reading it was like hearing the song for the first time again." "I never stopped hearing it," she said quietly. Cal looked away for a second, then met her eyes again. "Why didn't you just tell me? Because I didn't want it to feel like I was chasing a ghost," she said. "Or pressuring you into remembering something that maybe didn't matter to you." "It did," he said, "more than I can explain." They stood in silence for a moment. "I kept that guitar all these years," he continued. "Through 6 apartments, a storage unit, 2 cities, and that note stayed hidden the whole time. I think maybe I wasn't supposed to see it until now." Mira smiled softly. "Maybe that's the way memory works. It comes when we're ready to carry it again." Cal studied her, the scarf around her neck, the calm in her voice, the quiet force that had driven her back into his life, not out of nostalgia, but with purpose. "You really want me to help lead this thing?" he asked. "I want you to help build it," she replied. "Because it was you who taught me that some people give without asking for anything back. I think it's time the world learned how to do that again." He nodded, slow but certain. "I'm in," he said. Not because he needed a job, but because for the first time in a long time he felt like someone worth building something with. And this time, it wasn't about saving anyone. It was about remembering that someone once sang through a wall just to make sure a girl didn't feel alone. And that kindness, however small, was enough to echo through a lifetime. Mira stood at the window of her apartment, arms wrapped tightly around herself as the early evening lights of Boston blinked to life below. Her reflection in the glass looked like someone she didn't quite recognize, calm on the surface but storming underneath. She'd always been good at control. Good at setting boundaries, holding her emotions at arm's length, pushing herself further than necessary just to keep from looking back. But ever since Cal found that note, since they both remembered something had cracked open inside her. Not a wound. A door. And now they stood on either side of it, waiting to see who would walk through first. That morning, they'd met again, this time in the drafty auditorium of a once-abandoned community center in Roxbury that Mira's company had recently purchased for renovation. The floorboards creaked. The ceiling leaked near the back wall, but there was sunlight pouring through tall, dirty windows, and the bones of the place whispered promise. Cal stood near the makeshift stage, looking up at the rafters. "This could work. It has good bones," Mira agreed, stepping beside him. "Needs soul, though." He turned to her. "That's what we bring, isn't it?" She smiled, and for a moment they just stood there. Not CEO and candidate. Not strangers with a strange connection, but two people who had once comforted each other through vents and silence, finding each other again in a world that didn't usually give second chances. Then, without warning, the smile faded from Cal's face. He looked away. "I need to tell you something," he said. Mira waited, watching the muscles in his jaw twitch as if he were holding in words that had rusted with time. "I wasn't always like this," he said. "Tired, guarded. I used to think I was going somewhere. Music school, maybe. Touring. Writing songs that mattered." "You still write songs that matter?" she said softly. He shook his head. "I used to have a plan. But life doesn't always care about your plans. One bad fall, one medical bill, one moment of weakness, and suddenly everything you thought was solid turns to sand." He paused, then added, "Lila's mom. She left 2 months after Lila was born. Said she couldn't do it. Couldn't live in poverty. Couldn't handle a baby and a broke musician." Mira said nothing. She knew this was sacred ground, grief unspoken. "I never blamed her," Cal continued. "Well, not forever. We were both drowning. I just held on to the kid and decided I'd swim harder. But some days I was scared I'd drop her." His voice cracked then. "Not much. Just enough." "I know that fear," Mira whispered. He looked at her surprised. "I was adopted into a good home," she explained, "but for years I felt like I was just pretending to be the kind of daughter they deserved. I had night terrors until I was 12. I'd wake up screaming about people disappearing, and I'd hide under the bed because I thought if I stayed too visible, someone might send me back." Cal exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 20 years. "It never leaves, does it?" he asked. "No," she replied. "But it doesn't have to define us either." Later, they walked through the old classrooms and side halls discussing logistics, renovation timelines, local artist involvement, potential donors. But beneath the practical talk was a current neither could ignore. By the time they reached the front doors again, the sky had darkened. The first rumble of thunder echoed faintly in the distance. Mira paused. Cal glanced over. "You okay?" She hesitated. "I haven't liked storms since I was a kid," she admitted. "Especially thunder. I used to count the seconds between flashes and cracks, hoping if I could predict the sound, it wouldn't scare me as much." Cal nodded slowly. "That's why I started humming." She turned to him. "The first night I heard you crying through the vents, he said I didn't know what to do. So I just started humming. Figured if I was scared, you probably were too. You never knew it helped," she said. "I never knew you remembered," he replied. They stood there as the sky opened. Rain poured across the cracked pavement outside, soft at first, then heavier. The kind of storm that invited silence. And in that silence, Mira said, "We were kids. Lost to scared. But what you did for me, it was more than kindness. It was an anchor." He swallowed hard. "I didn't think I mattered that much." "You did," she said. "You still do." She reached into her bag and pulled out the note, his note now encased in a clear plastic sleeve to protect it from time and weather. "I've kept everything in my life neat," she continued. "Organized. Predictable. But this, you were the one wild thread I never let go of, even when I didn't know I was still holding it." Cal looked at the paper, then at her. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic music. Just two people standing in a forgotten building in the middle of a thunderstorm, staring at a memory that changed both of them. Then he reached for her hand. Not tightly. Just enough. Enough to say, "I remember too. I'm still here. Let's not run from it anymore." Outside, thunder rolled again. But inside, the storm finally began to pass. The room echoed with the sound of an out-of-tune piano and the hum of scaffolding being hoisted near the ceiling beams. Dust danced through the filtered afternoon light pouring in from the tall, now uncovered windows of the community center's main hall. The transformation was slow but steady. Cracked tiles replaced with fresh flooring, faded paint covered with warm earth tones, and the musty silence replaced with the cautious rhythm of people returning to build something new. Cal stood near the old stage sleeves, rolled up his guitar strapped loosely around his shoulder. He'd just finished tuning the instrument after helping a crew unload donated chairs, and now he waited. Nervous, unsure. Mira stepped in from the side entrance, clipboard in hand, her tailored coat traded for a navy blue cardigan, hair swept back into a simple braid. She looked lighter. Not casual exactly, but present. More herself than he'd ever seen her. "You ready?" she asked. He looked at her like a man balancing on a wire. Not even close. "Good," she said. "That means you'll feel everything." He let out a nervous laugh. "I haven't performed for anyone in years. I used to play Delilah in the back of our van. That's a far cry from a room full of strangers." "They're not strangers," Mira said. "They're pieces of the same world we came from. Just waiting to be reminded it can sound like music again." Cal inhaled deeply and nodded. Today was their first soft launch, a test event. A mix of donors, volunteers, local families, and community leaders had been invited for a casual preview of the program's vision. Music Art exhibits kid-friendly performances. No press, no speeches, just a shared moment. And at the center of it, the man who had once sung through a wall, now singing on a stage. Later that evening, the small crowd filled the room with gentle conversation and folding chairs. String lights glowed above like quiet stars. On one side of the hall, kids showcased hand-painted posters about dreams. On another, parents stood by tables of finger food and cider, many of them first-time visitors unsure what to expect. When Cal stepped onto the low platform, the room slowly hushed. He adjusted the mic. Cleared his throat. "I'm not used to this," he admitted, smiling nervously. "Most of my shows are in living rooms with stuffed animals and one very enthusiastic 6-year-old. Laughter rippled through the room. He looked down at his guitar. "But someone once told me that what matters isn't how many people hear you, it's whether someone needs to hear you. So, if this finds anyone tonight, then it's worth it." He began to play. The first few chords were gentle, familiar. Then came the melody, soft, warm, haunting in the way truth often is. And when he sang the first line, a hush fell so complete, it felt as though the walls themselves were listening. "Stars don't sleep. They just shine quieter at night. Close your eyes, little bird. I'll be here, out of sight." Mira stood at the edge of the room near the back, arms folded across her chest, but not to shield herself. Only to hold the moment still. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't blink. She didn't want to miss a second. Around her, people leaned in. A few mothers held their children tighter. One elderly woman in the corner closed her eyes and smiled. Someone exhaled softly through tears. When the final chord faded, the silence didn't immediately lift. It hovered like the last breath of a dream you didn't want to wake from. Then came applause. Not thunderous, but heartfelt. Whole. Cal stepped back from the mic, a little stunned, as if unsure whether the moment had actually happened. But then Lila ran up to the stage, arms raised like a cheerleader, and he caught her grinning as she shouted, "That's my daddy." The room laughed, clapped louder, and just like that, the spell transformed into joy. An hour later, after guests had filtered out and the last paper cups were tossed, Mira walked slowly back toward the stage where Cal was rapping chords. "You did it," she said softly. He turned. "We did." "No," she replied, stepping closer. "You did. You stood up and gave people something they didn't know they needed." He gave a humble shrug. It was just a song. She met his gaze unwavering. "You keep saying that, but it's never been just a song, Cal." He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "I used to think music was the only part of me that had value. When I lost the rest job's money direction, I held on to the guitar like it was the last thread tying me to anything good." "And now?" she asked. "Now," he said, his voice steadier, "I think the value wasn't in the music. It was in what it reached. The kid behind the wall, the daughter in the dark, the woman in the park." She felt her throat tighten. "And what about the man who never stopped singing?" she asked. He paused. I think he's starting to believe he said that he was worth hearing after all. They stood close now, not touching, but surrounded by the quiet hum of something unspoken rising. Then, softly, Mira said, "I want to add a new section to the program. A recording studio. Just one room. Simple but warm. A place for voices that were never heard when they should have been." Cal blinked, then smiled. "You really never do anything halfway, do you?" "I had to fight to be heard," she replied. "Now I want to build places where no one has to." He nodded. "I'd help lead that." "I know." They stood together for a while, looking around the half-finished room that had just become something more than walls and wires. It had become a sanctuary. For songs, for silence, for second chances, and for the quiet realization that sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer the world is your voice when you thought you had none left. The sun was barely up when the email arrived. Cal stared at it for a long moment, blinking twice just to make sure he was reading it right. The subject line was simple but jarring. Request for feature. The voice from the shelter. Boston Community Spotlight. It had come from a local lifestyle journalist, someone Mira had mentioned in passing weeks ago, but Cal never thought much of it. According to the email, they wanted to run a full feature, a father who used music to help his daughter who turned childhood trauma into a platform for healing others. There was even talk of a segment on the regional morning news. Cal's hands hovered over the keyboard. Then he closed the laptop. He didn't feel ready. Later that morning, he stood in the renovated music room at the community center, his fingers brushing over the soundboard. Mira's vision for the CJ project was unfolding rapidly. Small classes had already started, and weekend workshops were drawing more families than they'd anticipated. The community was responding. Donors were calling. Parents were asking how to get their kids involved. For the first time in years, Cal wasn't just surviving, he was creating something that lasted beyond a paycheck. But fame, publicity. That wasn't what he signed up for. He turned when he heard Mira's footsteps behind him. She held a copy of the email in her hand, printed as if she knew he wouldn't bring it up himself. "You saw it," she asked gently. "I saw it, and I don't want this to turn into a circus." Mira nodded, not surprised. "It doesn't have to. But people are noticing, and some of them need to hear what you've lived. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's real." Cal shook his head. "What if they start digging into my past? Into Lila's mom? Into everything I failed at?" "You didn't fail," Mira said firmly. "You stayed. You fought. You built. And that story is exactly why people will listen. But what if they think I'm just some charity case who got lucky with the right woman showing up at the right time?" Mira's gaze softened, but her tone stayed steady. "Then, maybe they'll also see a man who could have shut the door on that woman but didn't, who kept showing up for his kid when no one showed up for him." He looked away, jaw tight. "You think this is about me?" She continued, stepping closer, "But it's not. It's about every father out there who thinks he has to disappear in order to protect his kid from disappointment. It's about every child still waiting to hear a lullaby through the wall." That silenced him, because somewhere deep down, he knew she was right. That weekend, the article went live. The title, From Vents to Voices, One Father's Song of Survival. There was a photo of Cal sitting on the edge of the community center's new stage, Lila in his lap, both of them smiling mid-laugh. The story detailed his journey, not just the music, but the loneliness, the failures, the quiet acts of perseverance. It also mentioned Mira not as a savior, but as someone whose past ran parallel to his. A reunion, not of romance, but of recognition. The piece was gentle, respectful, but it was enough to ripple. Social media picked it up. Other nonprofits reached out, teachers, therapists, single parents. Emails poured into the community center's inbox with the subject line, "That story saved me, or I thought I was alone." It was overwhelming, and then the inevitable. A local morning show called. They wanted both Cal and Mira to appear for a 10-minute live interview. Cal resisted, hard, but Mira had a plan. "You don't have to go," she said calmly the day before the segment. "But I'd like to." He studied her, unsure. She smiled. "You once gave me your voice. Let me return the favor." The next morning, Cal stood in his kitchen watching the segment on his laptop while Lila ate cereal at the table. Mira looked poised, radiant on camera, but real. She spoke from the heart about growing up in the foster system, about loneliness, about the power of small kindnesses that echo into adulthood. When the interviewer asked about the man behind the music, Mira didn't flinch. "He's not a headline," she said. "He's a father who chose to stay when staying was hard. He's the voice I heard when I was most afraid. And now he's making sure other people hear their own." Cal felt his throat tighten. Lila, spoon in midair, said, "She's talking about you." He nodded. "She's really nice," Lila added, then paused. "Do you like her?" Cal blinked. "What you look at her like when you sing my favorite song. The one with the stars." He laughed, surprised. "You notice that I notice everything," Lila said proudly, then shoveled more cereal into her mouth. That evening, as twilight settled in, Cal walked to the park with Lila on his shoulders. She giggled as she reached for leaves overhead, feet kicking gently against his chest. They passed the old bench, the same one where this all began. And there, as if drawn by gravity, stood Mira. She was watching the sky. He stopped beside her. "You did well this morning," he said. "I spoke the truth," she replied. "That's easier when it's not about you." Cal glanced up at the fading light. She said, "I look at you the way I sing her favorite song." Mira turned. "Is that a good thing, I think," he said. "Slowly, it means you're safe, familiar, and kind of essential." They both smiled quietly. No rush, no declarations, just something forming between them, slow and solid, like a melody returning after a long pause. Mira looked at Lila now, curled against Cal's shoulder, drowsy from the walk. "She's lucky," she whispered. "So am I," Cal said, without hesitation. And in that quiet moment beneath the soft wash of dusk and memory, they stood together, not as headlines or projects or ghosts of who they once were, but as a man, a woman, and a child, each of them learning how to be seen, and heard, and whole. The air inside the community center buzzed with the anticipation of something just beyond definition, something not quite a performance, not quite a fundraiser, and far more than either. Tonight was the gala. Not a black tie affair, but a heart-crafted celebration. A culmination of months of work, of late-night rehearsals, chipped paint, and grant proposals. There were fairy lights strung across the ceiling beams, a makeshift stage surrounded by mismatched folding chairs and tables covered in hand-painted tablecloths from the art therapy program. For Cal, it was surreal. He stood behind the curtain on stage left, adjusting the strap of his guitar for the 10th time, his pulse tapping against his ribs like a frantic metronome. Mira had named the event The First Note, as if to remind them all that this wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. He peeked through the curtain. The room was packed. Families from the shelter program, donors in worn suits and borrowed dresses, local musicians, and teens who used to skip school now volunteering to serve punch. And in the third row, with her hair in a lopsided braid and her best sparkly dress, sat Lila, kicking her legs and watching the stage like it was the doorway to magic. Next to her sat Mira. She looked elegant but unpretentious, her dress simple, her expression focused, serene, and strong. She met Cal's eyes, and in that brief glance he found stillness. He stepped back, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. It wasn't just a song tonight. It was a full circle. Backstage, one of the center's teen volunteers ran up holding a flash drive and looking panicked. "Mr. Cal. The AV guy says your intro video's missing from the folder." Cal frowned. "It should be on there. I double-checked. We've only got Mira's speech in the slideshow." Cal sighed, ready to head toward the tech table, but Mira appeared instead, walking calmly toward the chaos like she was made for it. "I took it out," she said gently. Cal blinked. What? She placed a hand on his arm. You don't need a video to tell your story, Cal. You are the story. Tonight you show them the voice that never gave up. He hesitated, unsure. But then she said, this song doesn't need anything else. Just your heart, and maybe a little bit of courage. He smiled. A little bit, huh? Okay, she admitted, maybe a lot. When Cal walked onto the stage, the applause surprised him. It was full-bodied, not polite, earned. He stood at the mic, cleared his throat, and let the quiet settle. The lights warmed his face. He didn't have notes, didn't need them. I want to thank you all for being here tonight, he said, voice steady despite the tremble in his chest, for believing that stories don't end where pain begins. A few people nodded. Some murmured agreement. One woman dabbed her eyes already. I didn't grow up thinking I'd be here on a stage playing music surrounded by people who care. I thought I'd always be on the outside trying not to take up too much space. He glanced at Mira. But someone once told me that kindness doesn't disappear, it just waits for the right moment to be seen again. And sometimes a song is the only way we know how to say, I'm still here. So tonight, I want to sing the first song I ever truly wrote. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And I sang it through a wall to a little girl who needed it. He looked at Mira, and though no one else could see the full story in that moment, it was enough for her to reach up, press a hand to her chest, and smile like she'd never smiled before. He turned to the mic and began. Stars don't sleep. They just shine quieter at night. Close your eyes, little bird, I'll be here. Out of sight. His voice wasn't flawless, but it was true. The room stilled utterly still as the words floated out like something sacred. Mira's fingers curled over Lila's, who leaned against her shoulder without looking away. No phones, no flashes, just the sound of one voice, and the silence of 100 people remembering what it felt like to be safe. As the final note faded, no one moved. Then came the sound. Not just applause, but the slow rise of people standing, one by one, like they knew the weight of what they had witnessed. Cal stood still, overwhelmed, until Lila broke from the row and ran up the steps, arms flung wide. He scooped her up, held her tightly, and for once didn't try to hide the tears. She whispered in his ear, You were amazing, Daddy. He whispered back, So were you, baby. Mira approached the stage, eyes glistening. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply reached out, took his free hand, and held it like an anchor in the middle of a sea of light. Later that night, as the chairs were folded and lights dimmed, Cal stood in the entryway, watching as families lingered, laughing, hugging, holding on to something they hadn't known they needed. Mira joined him, her coat draped over her arm. You realize you just started something, she said. I think we both did, he replied. She nodded. There's still so much to do. I know. But tonight was what the song was meant for. Cal turned to her. I think it was meant for this, all of it. You, me, Lila, every kid who'll walk through that door and wonder if they matter. She looked at him, eyes soft. And when they do, we'll be here, he said, singing, until they believe it. And outside, beneath a quiet sky of city stars, soft, persistent, and alive, Boston exhaled. And somewhere in that exhale, a boy and a girl who once survived a shelter found what they had unknowingly built together. A place where no voice went unheard. A home made of song. The snow fell softly that morning. Flakes slow and weightless, like the world had exhaled overnight and decided to let everything rest just for a while. Inside the community center, the warmth wasn't just from the radiators or the fresh brewed coffee in the corner, it came from the voices. Children laughing down the hall during a songwriting workshop. A mother humming along to a tune in the art room. An older man with trembling hands helping a boy tune a second-hand guitar. There was music everywhere, not loud or flashy, but woven into the walls, into the breath of the place. And at the heart of it stood Cal. He was kneeling beside Lila near the large mural the kids had painted along the far wall. She pointed proudly at the small bird she had drawn, nestled on a branch next to a guitar and two figures hand in hand under a night sky. "That's you and Mira," she said confidently. "And me." Cal smiled. "You think so, I know." So Lila replied, hands on her hips like a miniature general. "And the bird is the song, because songs fly even when people can't." He pulled her into his arms and whispered into her hair, "You're the best song I've ever written." Behind him, Mira approached with a clipboard. Her pace unhurried, her expression soft. She wore her favorite gray wool coat, the sleeves pushed up to reveal the ink stains on her wrist remnants from scribbling notes with the kids earlier that morning. "We're over capacity again," she said, but it wasn't a complaint. Cal chuckled. "Good thing we're getting that grant next month." She smiled, still pretending you're not one of the reasons we're getting it. Just trying to stay humble. "Well, you failed," she teased. They stood there watching the room around them bloom with life. What had once been cracked tiles and forgotten walls was now a place where music and memory danced together. Mira reached into her coat and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I have something for you." Cal raised an eyebrow. "Is it another funding proposal?" "Open it." He carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a vinyl record, handmade. The label was simple, printed in block letters, the CJ Sessions, Volume 1. Voices that made it. Below that, dedicated to the ones who sang in silence. Cal stared at it, blinking fast. "This is the first official project from the recording studio," Mira said. "All the kids who've written original songs this year. We pressed a limited batch. Yours is the first copy." His voice caught. "You're amazing. You're the reason it exists," she said. "You helped us hear what mattered." He stepped forward, closed the space between them. "I didn't know how much I needed to be heard until someone like you actually listened." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "And I didn't know how much I needed to believe in people again until you sang that song." Silence settled between them, warm and weightless like the snow outside. Cal reached for her hand. She took it without hesitation. They walked together to the front windows, watching the snow fall outside over Boston's rooftops. Lila sat nearby, coloring again, humming the lullaby under her breath. Stars don't sleep. They just shine quieter at night. It had been months since that afternoon in the park, since the note in the guitar case, since the realization that they had known each other long before they had met. Now, nothing between them felt like coincidence, only timing, hard-earned, worth waiting for. Mira leaned her head on Cal's shoulder. "Do you ever think about how unlikely this was every day?" he said. "But then I remember that the things most worth finding usually start out quiet, like a voice through a wall, or a girl at a park who didn't walk away." She smiled against him. Outside, a family approached the front doors, mother, father, two kids in hand-me-down coats. They hesitated on the steps, unsure. Mira turned to Cal. "Want to do the honors?" He stepped forward and opened the door wide. "Welcome," he said, voice warm. "Come in from the cold." And they did. 1 month later. A photograph went up in the main hallway, a simple frame. Inside it, a young girl's drawing a bird on a branch, two people holding hands under a night sky, and a single lyric scrawled in bright purple crayon beneath "Even quiet songs can save someone." The plaque beside it read, "The Voice from the Shelter Founded 2025. A place where no child is forgotten, where every voice has a home." And so the song lived on. Not just in chords and verses, but in kindness offered, doors opened, and lives rewritten. Because sometimes the most extraordinary miracles aren't loud or obvious. They begin in silence and rise when someone finally listens. Certainly, here's a warm, emotionally resonant outro interaction prompt written in natural conversational English, perfectly suited for the tone of your video. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know. Drop a comment and share your thoughts, or just say hello. Your stories and reflections mean the world to us. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories about love, kindness, and the quiet miracles that change lives. Thank you for spending your time with us. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep listening for the songs that bring us home.